Good morning, everyone. And what a passage that we've just read. Today we continue to look at the account of 1 Kings, now reaching, as you have just heard, chapter 2. And we're going to be thinking about how to establish a kingdom. Now, in the story so far, Israel's great King David was dying. And the issue of who would be king next was raised. His oldest remaining son, Adonijah, tried to seize power. But last week, we saw how God provided for David's younger son, Solomon, to succeed as king instead. And now our passage today moves to old David's bedside and records for us his last words in his last moments. And here's a deep thought for you all to consider because of where we are in the story. What would you say to your loved ones in your last moments? What would be your legacy, your memory? What would you pass on to your children or friends or to others as your chapter in this life comes to a close? Would it be words of love? Maybe words of regret? Maybe confessions of a crime? Or some secret that people need to know? What would be the main thing on your mind? Well, David is described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. He wasn't perfect, and he had some massive failings, but deep in his heart, he wanted to please God. He loved God, and as the account of his life shows, God loved him. So perhaps it is unsurprising that his last words were about God and God's promise to him about the kingdom that his son, Solomon, was to rule over. And with his dying breath, David charges Solomon with two things concerning kingship. He tells him to walk in the ways of the Lord, and he also tells him to deal with a number of people. Well, let's look at these. Concerning walking in the ways of the Lord, David opens by telling Solomon to be strong, to act like a man. And these words remind us of God's words to Joshua when he became Israel's leader many years before, to be strong and very courageous. But what was Solomon to have strength for? Strength is certainly an important thing that's needed for the heavy task of being king, for being the one responsible over a whole nation. But look what David is primarily concerned with in calling Solomon to strength. He says, be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations as written in the laws of Moses. Where was Solomon to exert himself to apply his strength? In knowing and living in obedience to God's word. David wasn't calling him to strengthen battle. He wasn't calling him to be brave in the face of, his dad's death, in the face of immense grief. No, he was calling him to strength in obedience. And obedience certainly requires strength. David knew, as we do today, that it takes real strength and courage to stand firm against the temptation of the world around us and to remain in God's ways. And here, in what David has just said, we also see a glimpse or a vision of what David thinks God's promised king of God's promised kingdom should be like. God's promised king should be someone who walks strongly in the ways of the Lord. And walking with God is a key to the king's success. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, says David to Solomon. David had, of course, experienced God's goodness to him as he obeyed God. You know, what he says here, obey God and you may prosper, is not inspirational poster words that he's posting to him. It's not stuff that he's saying in theory. No. David knows these words in his very own life. It is the secret to true success that he has discovered in the course of his whole life, and now he passes it on to Solomon. If Solomon was going to be a successful king, he needed to walk in the ways of the Lord. Although one thing to note here is that the prosperity Solomon would experience would be according to God's will, not his will. It's follow me and not receive whatever you want. It's follow me and God will bless you according to his wisdom and his goodness. There's no prosperity gospel here. And if Solomon ruled as God commanded, then Solomon would see great success and blessing in his rule. And in fact, the greatest success that Solomon and any of David's later descendants could expect to see related to an important promise that God had made to David, that if they followed God, God would ensure that David would always have a successor on the throne of Israel. Now, up until here, most of us would not have had any issues reading this first part of David's charge. But as we come to the second part, we might be a bit more uncomfortable, or we might have more reservations about what David has advised Solomon to do. For here, David talks about, yes, showing kindness to a family, the family of Barzillai, but he also talks about killing a couple of people. First, Joab, who was David's very competent but also very amoral wild card general who had killed two other generals in peacetime. And secondly, Shimei, a man who cursed David greatly back when David's first son Absalom was leading a coup and David was on the run and vulnerable. What do you think of these instructions? What's going on here? Why is David talking about what we know as godly living one moment and then talking about killing people the next, particularly people who have hurt him? Did he really go from godly piety to sort of crying, "Avenge me," on his deathbed? Is that what's happening? Or maybe is this perhaps cold, calculated political maneuvering? That David wanted Solomon to have a stable kingdom, and the reality is Joab and Shimei are sources of instability. They could become problems for having a stable and prosperous kingdom. Is that what's happening? It's actually kind of really hard to tell from the text itself. And naturally, that means that scholars don't agree. But maybe it's neither of those. If David was earnest in telling Solomon just before this to follow God's ways, then let me suggest that one important way, not the only way, but one important way to see these instructions is as a call for Solomon to not shy away from upholding justice in this kingdom. God's kingdom was, after all, to be a kingdom of justice. And Solomon, as God's appointed king, was not to tolerate unjust elements within it. The peacetime murders by Joab, the cursing and rebellion by Shimei, these things all deserve death according to God's law, according to the law of Moses, written in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And Solomon was to deal appropriately with all of them. And so to do these things could well be justice and righteousness. Still, if you felt any discomfort in hearing the words, it's actually probably healthy for us to feel some discomfort reading all this, because there's a fine line between righteousness and self-righteousness, between proper justice and doing what's right and personal vengeance. Only God judges and wields justice perfectly. Human beings can never do it. We'll never be certain how much personal vindictiveness influenced David's words that we've just heard, or how much anger or perhaps paranoia affected Solomon's actions that we'll hear about coming up next. But we do know from personal experience that it's too easy for self-serving tendencies to slip into our attempts at doing what is right in almost any arena. Given both that and the ample examples of broken leadership that we see around us today, just check the recent news, and we're probably right to be wary of anything that looks like abuse of power in ourselves and in others around us. Nonetheless, I think it's still valuable to see in David's words today, even to these commands, at least a glimpse or a vision of godly governance, that God's king was to be someone who walked in God's ways and who would uphold justice by showing both by showing kindness to the faithful and dealing with evil. And having said all this, David dies. And we read Solomon is now king over Israel. His rule is now firmly established. Does Solomon act on David's words, on the charge that David had given to him? Let's look briefly at the rest of chapter 2 and see. After David's death, it does not take long for trouble to come to Solomon. You might remember I mentioned Adonijah, David's oldest still living son. It turns out that Adonijah, who had previously tried to take the throne, had not actually given up aspirations for that throne. And he approached Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, with a peculiar request. He says, "Please ask King Solomon, he will not refuse you, to give me Abishag the Shunammite as my wife." You might remember Abishag the Shunammite as the young woman who was brought in to help keep dying King David warm. In those ancient times, the successor to a king would inherit the king's harem. So Adonijah's request here to ask Abishag to be his wife was not romantic. What he wanted was the most recent addition to King David's harem. This was a bid for another chance to claw at the throne. Bathsheba relays his request, and Solomon sees it for what it is. And he calls out in rage at hearing the request, "Why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? You might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he is my older brother. Yes, for him and for Abiathar the priest and Joab, son of Zeruiah." Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request." And as we read Solomon's fury and judgment here, we should remember that Solomon had previously shown Adonijah mercy. He had spared Adonijah for his attempted coup the first time around. Adonijah was told to go home, to essentially let go of these aspirations and return to normal life. Unfortunately, as we've just seen, Adonijah would not. And so despite an initial mercy, Solomon, in chapter 2, had him executed. Solomon then moved on to deal with the rest of the coup members. First, he dismissed Abiathar the priest from the priesthood. Abiathar deserved death for his part in the treason, but Solomon showed him mercy because of his history, because of his previous service to King David. And then secondly, he sentences Joab to death. And here, Joab's demise, although is being initiated by the conspiracy that he was part of, Solomon makes it clear that the judgment is primarily for that which David spoke about, that justice comes to Joab for his shedding of innocent blood in peacetime. And so, Solomon acted on David's charge, the first part. And the last part of chapter 2, Solomon acts on the last part of David's charge, to deal with Shimei the Benjamite and his cursing of David's kingdom. Interestingly though, Solomon deals more kindly with Shimei than we might expect from David's last words. He does not sentence him immediately to death, but instead issues a command and makes Shimei vow an oath to God that Shimei is to build a house and stay in Jerusalem. And if he did that, he would live. Shimei accepts this arrangement, saying, "What you say is good." And he stays in Jerusalem for a long time. It also seems that he's quite comfortable. Like he wasn't restricted in any other ways, and he was still rich enough to have multiple slaves, at least 3 or more. Unfortunately, 3 years later, Shimei does leave Jerusalem, chasing after 2 slaves who had run away 40 kilometers west to a place called Gath. Did Shimei not remember his agreement with David? Is that even possible when your life is on the line in such an arrangement? We're not sure exactly what Shimei was thinking, but either way, he forfeited the mercy shown to him, and Solomon executes him, both as part of the broken oath that he had made before God, but also for his crimes and evils against David. And so chapter 2 closes with this statement, that with all of the grumblers and all of the sedition and rebellion against God's king now removed, and a sort of justice carried out, God's kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. What kind of reflections can we have from this account? What do we learn from here? We've seen a glimpse of right rulership, of what David thought God's promised king should be like. We've seen Solomon try to act with mercy and justice and wisdom. And we've also noted a sense of unease that we as modern readers feel as we read the text. Standing on this side of history now, we know that Solomon's kingdom was not eternal. It was not the kingdom's final form. David's expectation for the promised king was only partially realized in Solomon. Yes, Solomon exercised wisdom and mercy and justice, but he was not perfect, as the further chapters of 1 Kings, and in fact even today's chapter, attest to us. But the Bible's astonishing message is that a far greater king, who is righteous and wise and good beyond anything that David or Solomon could be, has come and has already begun to reign. The New Testament teaches us that Jesus is the promised son of King David, the true promised son, the true promised king, declared to be such by his resurrection from the dead. And many elements of Solomon's imperfect rule that we read even today look forward to the kingdom that Jesus has now established. Jesus' mercy, for example, is greater than Solomon's mercy. As we saw, Solomon did, in fact, show mercy to those who opposed him. Well, Jesus does so too, but even more so. The wonderful message of the gospel is one of love and mercy, that by his death on the cross, Jesus allowed all who don't know, all those who don't care, or those who even hate God, to not only receive God's forgiveness, but also the privilege of being invited back in to becoming God's children. And for the past 2,000 years, Jesus has been calling to everyone, to all of us, to take hold of this mercy, even today. Jesus' mercy is far greater than Solomon's mercy. But Jesus' justice is also greater than Solomon's justice. As we saw, Solomon judged the evil elements in his kingdom. And Jesus does so too, but even more so. He is the ultimate judge of the whole world. On a future day, known to us as the last day, or perhaps known as Judgment Day in popular media, everyone will be judged, and all evil, and all who do evil, will be destroyed. On that last Judgment Day, Jesus will right all wrongs and will remove all evil from his world. And this is wonderful news, but also terrifying news. A world without evil would be amazing. But are we ready for this? On the last day, anyone who has not correctly received Jesus' mercy will have to meet his justice by themselves. And then what will happen? What will happen to me? What will happen to you if we have not correctly received Jesus' mercy? This is an uncomfortable thought, but it is also a true thought, as the Bible assures us. Thanks be to God that there is more to the gospel than this judgment. But know this, that there is not less. Perfect justice is coming. Have you received Jesus' mercy correctly? A last couple of short points as we end. Firstly, that Christians take note. Today's passage raises to us God's concern for righteousness and for dealing with evil. And so we're to ask the same question of ourselves. Are we concerned about righteousness and dealing with evil? Do we turn a blind eye to sin? Or are we careful to name it and call for repentance when we see it? Know this, that any sin left untreated festers and pulls us away from God. We see, in today's passage, we saw things like power hunger, lawlessness, maliciousness, possibly vindictiveness. Do we see this in ourselves? Do we see this in our community? Further, we all know our own sins that we are perhaps too ashamed to speak of. Are we dealing with them? Jesus, God's promised King, cares about the righteousness of his people and gives strength to overcome and to correct sin. And so we should also care about the righteousness of us as his people and be strong to deal with sin. And as a final exhortation, as much as we're not going to be succeeding David as king, the first part of David's charge to Solomon, to walk in the ways of the Lord, is still God's wisdom for all of us today. Brothers and sisters, how are we to live in God's kingdom today? Today's passage says to us, Be strong and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and his commands, his laws and his regulations. And as we do this, brothers and sisters, may we truly come to flourish under our promised King as his people. God's blessing be with you all.